Well, hey, it's Dr. Scott Langford, and I am delighted to be joined by Kell Cowley, who is a YA and Cli-fi author based in the UK, who I first met as the author of an award-winning Cli-fi short story in a contest here in the United States that the University of Arizona was running a couple years ago called Everything Changed. And I was using her short story so consistently, and students loved it. And she has since gone on to launch a whole series of books, some of them Cli-fi based on that original story and beyond, and now historical fiction. And so we're here today in an international education context to talk about YA literature and Cli-fi literature. And Kell is joining us live from the UK. Welcome to the Stanford Gen Educators Network, Kelly.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
So delighted. Now, can you catch me up a little bit on your writing career since then? You are a librarian as well. We both have more than one hat that we wear. I do too. I'm a community college instructor in English, as you know, and I do teach children's literature, which is the topic today, and I use YA in my own classes. But when you don't have your librarian's hat on, tell us a little bit about the series of books that you've been working on.
Yeah, so I do kind of jump a little bit between the two series. It's a sort of a different, in a way, I've actually been, since the COVID crisis, I've oddly been working a bit more on historical fiction, I guess because it's slightly more an escape in a way, to sort of think back to, I don't know why, going back to my historical fiction is set in Elizabethan England, you know, a time of, you know, plenty of plagues going around. So it's not like they don't have those troubles. They probably do. It's probably felt so much worse, but it helped me to get out of the current times. So the historical trilogy, which the second book is due to come out this spring, it follows a group of traveling players in Elizabethan England towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, and it's really something I wrote mainly because I was always a fan of sort of Shakespeare and got interested in studying what the life of Shakespearean players was, particularly the traveling players troops, because the sort of players you hear more about who were based in the London playhouses were really like, you know, they were the sort of aristocracy of the theatre at that time, where there were these traveling players troops who were sort of thought of as no better than vagrants. Really, they were not really, and they, you know, they could get arrested or you know, put in a sort of correction house for just going on and putting them on their own plays. So I was interested in the lives of those sort of players, and the main character in that one, because it is a YA one, is the young boy who was hired to play the female role, which was sort of tradition at the time, and it sort of becomes a queer coming of age story where that sort of you know, the sort of gender fluidity he develops playing the girl characters makes him question his own gender identity, question his sexuality. So it's I think it's interesting to tell those sorts of stories in historical context, whereas nowadays we have a lot of more discussion on queer identity and things like pronouns and you know, and how to sort of find a way to sort of label or come to terms with, and those sort of things do help, but sort of taking it back to a time when one, it was sort of something that you could still, you know, again, you could get locked up for. It was something that was widely known in the Elizabethan period, that, you know, there was, you know, there was bisexuality was almost the norm among men in that time. So it's something that is worth exploring, and was definitely going on at the time. I mean, there's plenty of references to it in Shakespeare's plays and poems, and indeed all the other playwrights of that day. So it's something that
it's curious that I happen to be, I'm also teaching queer lit right now.
Yeah.
I do children's lit, but that's, I kind of rotate back and forth in the spring quarter at Foothill College where I teach. But in my queer lit course, we just finished reading Orlando, which of course also does what you do in a brilliant and wonderful way, which is a kind of gender fluid historical fiction. In fact, I guess we could credit Virginia Woolf for pioneering the field in that way. So that's fantastic that you have a YA gender fluid, queer themed. I might have to add you to my syllabus one more time, Kel.
So, well, that's hopefully going to be 3 books. At the moment, the second one's coming out this year, quite soon. The last thing I wrote was actually another story. It was actually another Cli-fi short story, which I entered in this competition, which I'm still waiting to hear back from. But whether I get anywhere with it or not, it sounds like it's going to be good for your course. It's a course. It's again aiming towards being an anthology release called Imagine 22,000. So it's basically was challenging people to write, or challenging writers to write short stories with a vision of that sort of, a future like 180 years from now, and what that would look like. And one of the things I found really challenging was they said they were specifically looking for, this is a sort of new genre term along with Cli-fi, they were particularly looking for hope punk, which is which is a sort of fairly emerging genre, which is because I think Cli-fi, especially the Cli-fi I've written, and I know a lot of other people tend to write, tends to be quite dystopian. The hope punk angle was really looking for, let's have some short stories, Cli-fi stories that are actually quite optimistic and are looking for, they were very much like, it doesn't have to be all sunshine and roses. It can, it's very much like, take what realistic solutions we have and imagine us like making the right choices and going towards the right solutions. So that was really, I really enjoyed writing something for that. And I just set it in the Cli-fi verse that I've set, that I've been working on stories for, which started with Shrinking Thinking Land, which I know you've taught. That began as a short story, which then was expanded into a novel. And I've written a prequel for the, what's that?
It's exciting. I want to mention again in a connection that with the Hope Punk connection, that one of the other stories that I used from the anthology way back, the University of Arizona online anthology. It's an excellent source. Everything Changed, and they've actually done the contest several more times now.
And there's a sequel one out, yeah.
But the other story that I routinely use is from a genre that was kind of developed, similar genre in San Francisco Bay Area, my home base, called Solarpunk. And Solarpunk was a twist on biopunk. I actually had a friend at Stanford who was a graduate student who wrote her dissertation on the various kind of cyberpunk, biopunk, solarpunk genres. But where biopunk had been super testosterone toxic masculinity was on display. I was like, let's hack the biosphere, but just so that we can kind of have just because we're young men and when we just want to make a mess, almost this kind of unconscious Frankenstein kind of thing. Speaking of roots of YA and sci-fi and Cli-fi, but Solarpunk, quite similar to the Hope Punk, was to say, well, what if this was more gender fluid, more inclusive of women, and especially strong women. So the protagonist of the story, which is called Sunshine State, that's right.
Yeah, I know the one. Yeah.
Sunshine State's protagonist had actually had a couple, but there was a fabulous kind of genius biologist, rogue biologist, scientist, a female. That's so rare in normal cyberpunk. And a kind of gender fluid veteran of the military, super salesperson. So it's interesting that those overlaps are, again, quite international and cross-cultural. I'm so excited that you just keep us, every time I speak with you, you kind of astound me in the ways that you've branched out. Really proud of you for
Oh.
Well,
thank you.
It's not easy out there.
Well, I do thank you, because I know you've put me in touch with a lot of readers, which are sort of key target audience really for Cli-fi. It's very niche genre, and I still do find people who you'll say Cli-fi and they're not sure what it is, but it's getting more and more mainstream. I mean, we have what is the most mainstream writing publication in England. It's just literally called the Writing Magazine. and it's the main creative writing magazine in the UK. And I was looking at the short story competitions they're coming up, and even they're having a Cli-fi short story competition this summer. And like flashback to like 5 years ago when it was Everything Changed, that was at the time, I think that was the first major Cli-fi competition. So it's only been about 5 years that it started to sort of become a sort of mainstream thing. And it is coming into YA as well. I wish I'd got a little bit further in this book, but I just started reading a book that came out in England, I think this week or last week, called what's it called? I think it's called The Outlaws Scarlet and Brown, and it's set in it's sort of after my own heart because it's set in a sort of a Cli-fi future Britain. And this is another one I was going to say if you wanted a good recommendation for your reading list. I haven't finished reading it yet. I am literally only in the first 6 or 7 chapters, but I'm already loving it. It's by an author who is called Jonathan Stroud, and he's a very well established British children's author. Wrote an amazing fantasy series called the Bartimaeus series, which is sort of a magical fantasy, and now he's doing Cli-fi, and it's absolutely it's brilliant, and again has a really great female protagonist in it, and it's almost like imagining it's like a very swampy Wild West type vision of a future England where like I say
well, you had sinkholes.
Exactly. They haven't had a sinkhole yet. They've got things like mutant rats and all this sort of stuff. It's really great so far. So I'm looking forward to reading more of that. But it is one of those things that's starting to trickle into YA. Another one I loved in like recent years was Neil Shusterman's Dry. I mean, anything by Neil Shusterman really in YA is great, but Dry was something he wrote about the California drought, which was inspired by the California drought, and was took that to the next level of like imagining this like small town in California where all the taps stopped running, and the sort of rush to the supermarket to grab any bottled water they could, and it suddenly
familiar in the pandemic.
Yeah, it became like this amazing horror story where it was almost like it had that kind of zombie apocalypse feel to it, of like how people would slowly like kind of lose their humanity and things like that, and if they would being deprived of water, it was that's a really amazing one.
Well, and I was just about to mention, this is something I've been thinking about that I really wanted to discuss with you, but my impression as a teacher is, and even as a human on the planet, I've struggled for many years in Cli-fi and various other forms of fiction, including YA, getting American citizens in particular to think long-term or to understand what it means to flatten the curve. That's sort of the buzzword that finally my students began to understand, that it doesn't have to be a light switch. We can't just wave some magic wand and make climate change go away. As you know, we could, if we stopped emitting CO2 immediately, completely by some sort of Harry Potter magic wand, and all of a sudden we never emitted another ounce of CO2 into the atmosphere, we would still be facing radical and destructive climate change for centuries to come. However, that's a little bit like saying you can't just snap your fingers and make COVID go away, but you can flatten the curve. You can take measures both scientifically and in terms of public policy, which will bring down the catastrophic impacts. And I feel like students are now better able to grasp what that means, at least most students. We have our population in the US that's not quite clear on the concept. However, I have a real hope that a hidden upside of the pandemic, there's certainly not many, is that people will have a better idea grasping what it means to mitigate a crisis and not just wait for it to go away or pretend that it's not there, et cetera, et cetera. And
it's absolutely, it's given us a growth, because probably not since like the Second World War. We've not really had a global crisis that has affected everywhere in the world. And yeah, it is one of those things where there are some like pretty you know, haunting parallels to climate change. One of the ones which I was thinking about recently is the fact that obviously a lot of people have talked about how the effects of climate change do disproportionately affect poorer countries, in like particularly like equatorial countries where, you know, or things like, you know, the islands in Oceania and things like that. And it's one of those things where I still talk to people, like, you know, I can remember just someone casually making a comment like, oh, there's all this hype about climate change, but you know, the weather's not so bad outside. And it's like, yeah, where we are in England, which is in a comfortable place in the world, there are places all over the world, like, you know, there's rainforests on fire, there's, you know, or you know, there's, it just because it isn't happening on your doorstep doesn't mean it's not happening. You know, there's people whose islands are sinking, you know. And I think there's still this privileged Western mindset of, if it isn't happening on our doorstep, it's, you know, it's not really happening. And the same goes with COVID. I mean, both Britain and the US are very close to establishing a herd immunity through vaccinations. And meanwhile, in India, they're having the worst crisis of COVID that any country has ever seen. So it's one of those things where we have to have a global kind of outlook, and we can't just say, well, as long as our country's fine, you know, because we both got this awful thing in Britain and America at the moment where they have the Britain first movement, America first movement, which is just you know, really sort of cynical and selfish and depressing mentality, which you know, I want no part of. I think it's one of those things that both with COVID and, you know, even in a bigger way with climate change to come, we've just got to have a global mindset of, like, you know, we're all on this one planet together. And that even, you know, and it's gone to show that we can't just say, well, we'll keep our country safe, because, you know, Britain and America both had a terrible time with COVID. We both thought we'd been like immune to it. We've had soaring death rates on both sides of the pond, and yeah,
Don't completely over. I mean, that's the thing. So the collapse in India, which is, as we speak, horrific, can come back around with variants and so on, as we all know. So the vaccines that are working so well may still be overwhelmed. But I do think that it will be very interesting to see. I've called this generation my pet name. There's actually a podcast at Stanford that uses exactly the same name, so I can't take credit. And they probably got it from somewhere else. But Generation Anthropocene, Generation A.
Yeah, we've actually did
the first generation that fully understands, or that will fully understand, that the crisis is upon us. And I think you could also now say, okay, Generation C as in COVID. But I do think that it will be interesting to see how much the mindset of this current generation is shaped deeply by having lived through this global pandemic. And I think it's going to be extremely decisive. But, you know, you can't know yet. We don't know first of all, we don't know what's right around the corner. Second of all, neither one of us is of the right age. So I don't know how their consciousness will be shaped. But I have this deep idea that already there's been a major permanent generational shift, and that living through this pandemic will alter the consciousness of, and the same way with Black Lives Matter, the same way with Me Too. I think there has been what we used to in the 70s call a consciousness shift. I think it's amorphous. I hope that it doesn't just vanish, and sometimes it seems that they do. You know, we had like the Marjorie Douglas Stoneman High School shootings in the US, and I think a lot of us my age thought, young people are finally standing up and they're taking on the National Rifle Association, and thank God, and this is, and then in the awful way that American politics often works, I think that much of that energy was derailed or crushed by the gun lobby. and just by also the sort of cynical process of a polarized electorate here in the US. But I have hope. And I think that all the way back to your first short story, all the way back to Shrinking, Sinking Land, for me, the theme that you absolutely crystallized was exactly that shift in consciousness, right? Between the mother and the daughter. And that is why that is actually when I teach the story and when I have students write the paper about the story, that's what I keep coming back to, because I thought you did a brilliant job of saying, this is a new world. And Shell, if I'm still remembering the
Yeah.
mother name right, and Shell's mindset is essentially a pre-apocalyptic, pre-climate catastrophe mindset. And her almost only response is to give up at some point. I just can't, right? And then your protagonist, umbrella in hand, so British, sort of takes the classic British umbrella, uses it as a shield, uses it as a weapon, but she says something. She has to go forth into the storm. Like, she has to face the storm. She has no choice. She's not, and I think that story is fundamental in the sense that, like, there's a massive consciousness shift here between an older generation that was either in denial about climate change, or we're so old we just, let me die before it gets any worse, kind of thing, which is horrible and cynical. But I mean, I have friends that talk that way all the time. Versus being young enough to say, well, this is my world, I have to live in it. What the hell are we going to do? So thank you, thank you for crystallizing that story. But here we are again, I hope, in a similar moment, right? Where maybe older folks like me are just going to sit in our sinkhole and have another Coke, which is part of the plot of the story, by the way. And it's just like go down with our little comfort foods and give up getting out of the sinkhole. Like, just give up. And it may be that the Greta Thunbergs of the world have to just say, well, okay, sit there in your damn sinkhole, but the rest of us have to do something about this. So that the adults, as Greta is so fond of and effective of saying, not fond, but as she's so effective of saying, that, like, the children have to become the adults. They have no choice, because we've abandoned adulthood. We're not there. Another book that I've never had the courage to teach that got a big press here in the US was called A Generation of Sociopaths.
Oh, really? I haven't read that.
Boomers like me. Well, and
I've heard of it, I think.
bit over the top, like, arguments like this, brilliantly written. The main reason I didn't teach it, teaching at a community college where we have a vast rainbow of students, and it's not a white majority school at all, is I felt that he, like, as with so many sociologists, he essentially constructed his argument only about privileged white people in the United States, as if we were, as all boomers were like me. And I don't think that, I think a Latinx student, I think an African-American student, I think an Asian American student, I think students from lower class backgrounds, less economically privileged students would rightly question whether that's really their parents, right? It's pretty hard to tell our dreamers that your parents are sociopaths and did nothing to help you. Now, I have to say that as a white guy from a middle class background who grew up in the 60s and 70s, it's a little bit of a frightening argument, because I think it does bear some weight. I used to joke, well, I mean, I still do. My generation was the generation that said we wanted to change the world. And so my cringy, dark humor joke is, yeah, we're the generation that wanted to change the world, and we did. Forever. Irrevocably. Alas. Right? And I think it's a terrible irony of the idealism of the boomer generation, of which I'm a part. There we go. But it is interesting to think about how YA has to be something completely different in the era of the Anthropocene.
Yeah. I mean, again, I sort of look at, I'm sort of a millennial sort of generation looking at this. And I think our generation was at one point, like, really the most privileged of generations, and that we were growing up, that we were growing up with all the technology, with you know, especially if you were kind of a Western millennial,
Cool.
and
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And we had, like, you know, and I think, you know, things like, we had things like 9/11, and war and terror that kind of characterized our childhood, as a way that we kind of grew up, you know, a little bit more. I suppose that was a bit of a political awakening, for our generation, and it made us quite opinionated. And we are a generation that likes to think of ourselves as quite politically correct and ethically minded and socially aware. But I do feel like the younger generation are actually more active than the millennials have been. I mean, I think it is sometimes quite fair to characterize the millennial generation as sort of being like a generation that talks a lot of, says, but doesn't always act in the way we've seen. Certainly I don't think there was. I mean, I used to do quite a lot of the protesting as a teenager. I went to a college down in Devon, which was a big arts town. It was actually the first. I don't know. You probably, as someone who's into environment, have heard about the transition town movement, which is the idea of towns sort of taking back their own economies and, not having chain stores and things in their stores. And Totnes was a town that, like, sort of had its own currency, and was all about, localized, using localized products and localized, like little local shops and self-owned businesses, and all about promoting that, and environmental stuff along with that. So that was where I was. So I sort of grew up with that sort of, like roots politics movement and fair trade and all that thing. So that was sort of, and I always felt like I was always on the fringes of what most of my generation were growing up with. And it was like, I was just, when I came home, it was like, oh, that's just Kelly being a hippie, it wasn't the mainstream at all. And I feel with the new generation, things like climate activism are now a mainstream idea. I mean, certainly when the students are at the school that I work at, the sixth formers where I work at, it was very much like it was a mainstream of the students. It wasn't just the odd alternative hippie-ish ones who were doing the protesting. It was a wide variety of them. And
case in point, let me reach over. I have to reach to get this book. So this is something I should be advertising to you anyway. So this is a brand new book called No Planet B. And
you were telling me about this.
Yeah, the subtitle, which is a little bit hard to see, is A Teen Vogue Guide to the Climate Crisis. And full disclosure, one of my students, Karita Kabir, has an essay that she wrote about the situation of women and the impact of climate change on women in Bangladesh, because her family has a Bangladeshi heritage. She's now transferred from Foothill and graduated from Georgetown and is out making big splashes in the world. But I have now assigned this book. Now it's not, YA can also be nonfiction. I guess the stereotype is that it's always fiction, but there's an astounding. This is brilliantly edited and put together.
No, I'm already looking at thinking I need a copy of that for my library.
Amazing and deeply intersectional. It's, in fact, the part 3 is really about intersectional identity, social justice, and environmental justice, and the intersection between the two. And I have to say that it's one of the best. I mean, I read about climate all the time because I'm a climate head and I try to do climate change across the curriculum. That's how I came upon you. That's how we got to be sort of cyber friends in the first place. But the writing in here is astoundingly good, and it's all literally by people under 20 years old, right? So it is a movement, and I think that the recognition, of course, they didn't invent this term, but the recognition by this generation that they've kind of been flim-flammed and that there is no planet B, and that other generations, yours and mine in particular, have just abandoned ship. Except you can't abandon ship. There's no lifeboat. I mean, the Titanic is steaming straight at the iceberg. It's really already hit it. And it's not that there's a lack of lifeboats. There are no lifeboats. Like, there's no lifeboat. Like, we're all going to go down with the ship one way or another. So I do think that that's where this newer generation may be truly decisive in ways that I think you completely understood when you started writing those stories. Like, it's, you know, the old phrase is that novelists write the first draft of history. And I do think that your fiction has, that's what it's supposed to do. Sci-fi and cli-fi, you're supposed to be projecting possible futures, and I think you did a brilliant job of it. But the real shift is psychological, not technological. That was one of the great things about your fiction, the parts that I'm familiar with, because in your cli-fi, there weren't all these whiz-bang technological fixes yet, right? And ordinary people were just muddling through in the very lovely way that you all do on your island, except that the muddle had turned into a 50-foot deep sinkhole under your flat, with your family completely dispossessed and a global hibernation on the way, and so on and so forth, right? But the superfixes, aside from the hibernation, were just not, and they're not. I mean, I do think that whatever we think we're going to do, unfortunately, is likely to be quite overwhelmed, at least initially. So that's me going on and on about this. By the way, you're mindful of your time. I noticed that we're coming up at the top of the hour. So whenever you want, if you want to start sort of turning this around, and Kell had wanted to ask some questions of me as a person who teaches children's literature and YA, so you're quite welcome to do that.
I've already put my recorder on because you started talking about some points that were really pertinent already. So I was like, I'm going to have to record this. But like I say, if you can give me a copy of the video as well, that'd be fantastic, or give me access to it, it would be brilliant. So I'll just go back to my questions, and we can carry on talking about fiction, because the next anthology publication that we're bringing out through my own writing press, which is our Voice Out press, which is something I do as a kind of collaborative in my hometown of Chester, where myself and Casey Finn, who is another Chester-based author, we both work in YA, and we became friends, and you know, we basically wanted to sort of take control of our own stories, and not only be publishing our own stories, but bringing other voices together, because we've got quite a nice circle of friends, many of whom are writers in this area. So we like to do sort of collaborative efforts like this. So the next anthology we're bringing out is called Teens of Tomorrow, and we launched this anthology in January, February of 2020, just before you know, we literally sent all the adverts out to the writing magazines and online just before.
Because I think it was either like, you know, Churchill was right that we're two great nations separated by a common language. So when I was doing London Campus Abroad, I got, once again, it's happened to me before, a whole earful of the British language that I had to actually stop and ask people to repeat. And you have your own wonderful kind of Midlands. Is it Midlands? Am I getting this right? Kind of
north, really, yeah, northwest.
Americans, we can't hear this, but you also have, there's a little bit of a distortion in your internet feed. So I didn't understand the title of your new series. So I want you to say it a little bit more slowly for the American.
I will say that clearly for you. So I'll send you a copy of. We've got the cover up online. It's you can pre-order it at the moment. So it's called Teens of Tomorrow, and it's an anthology of near and far-flung futures. Is how we've described it. Sorry, just let me quickly. I've had a little problem with. Oh no, it is recording still. So yeah, we sent an advert out like just before COVID became, you know, officially a pandemic, and we'd said that we wanted to have something that was future focused, and we were looking particularly. One of the things we were looking for was things like Cli-fi, but also things about you know, like social progressivism and different issues. Like, so we've got like stories on, you know, we've got a story set in America about the gun laws and how that could be something that is progress in future, or you know, or get worse in future. We've got a story, actually our winning entry was about the caste system in India, and how and these sort of like steeped traditions that are, you know, that young people are starting to stand up against. There's a Cli-fi one that's really nice, which is about like a teenage mum, like a teenager who's pregnant, and it's a sort of kid that was being like really apolitical so far, and is now like thinking not only about her own future, but that she's got this baby, and like going to sort of things like school strikes and sort of realizing the impact of that. We've got ones from all over the world. There's the stories. There's a great one set in Africa, which is set in Kenya, which is about a young boy who is a young farm boy in Kenya who's got a problem with lions coming in and taking off their cows. And
in this future, I'm glad they're still
yeah. So they've got, but the thing, that was one of the nearer future ones where it was all about him using technology to sort of build a sort of like almost like a robot with lights that would scare off the lions. So that's a sort of an example more of those hope punk ones. It's like, not all technology and technology advancement has to be bad. It can work in harmony with nature, so you don't have to just go out and hunt lions or things like that. So we've got all these sort of different ones. That's like I say, some are touching on things like Black Lives Matter. We've got one that's looking on that. Some are very sort of science fiction based. We've got one which is about a social media star who you find out over the course of the story is actually a cyborg, and she's been created as this sort of idealized teenage girl, and she's essentially just being used for she's been programmed and used to be like something that is people consume online as like an idealized image. And we've got one which is about space colonization. So there's one set in space, and the idea of like sort of when people have lost faith in Earth, that they'll like use space technology to go and explore the galaxy and probably find that there's nothing out there. The planet we've got is the one we should be investing in. So those are all the sort of stories there. So just to give you that, and yes, absolutely, agreed.
Yeah, some people are going to have to spend billions to find that out, but they're going to find it out sooner or later. I was going to mention to you, because I guess I'm still keying on All the Way Back to Everything Changed, which that anthology came out in 2015 or something.
I think it was. Well, the competition was in 2016, and I think the anthology came out.
And I didn't. So, but anyway, I wanted to mention, because I think it's actually quite relevant and interesting. There's another story in there that I often choose, and by the way, I choose it because my young readers choose it, right? So I mean, I've sort of let them steer me to the stories that they find most relatable and most powerful and most memorable. So your story is always at the top of the list, and Sunshine State, that we mentioned before, with its sort of gender fluid and its Solarpunk outlook. But there's a third story that I very frequently use, called The Grandchild Paradox. And I
really like that one. That was my favorite.
Worth redescribing is that you take the very standard, so if you take any kind of a sci-fi class, or if you're a sci-fi writer, as Kell is, then you know that the grandfather paradox famously is the idea that, well, if you go back in time and you change something, anything, if you alter anything, you think, oh, I'll go back and I'll strangle Hitler in his crib, or I will whatever, right? That everything changes because that sort of butterfly effect of time. And so you've not only killed off your own grandfather. If you killed off your grandfather, then you've killed off yourself, and you're not even there, and there is no future to go back to. So that's the standard grandfather paradox. Brilliantly, this story, and I think, again, incredibly poignantly, I think this story really deserves to be discussed in this way. Brilliantly, it turns it around and talks about, well, what about the grandchild paradox? And so there's a young couple, and they're pregnant, or they're trying to think about whether, shall we get pregnant? Shall we get married? Shall we have a future? But there is no future. They're they're on an island which is slowly going underwater, and people my age have taken up all the resources, and they're living on the docks out of canned food that's salvaged. It's very bleak. And the grandchild paradox, of course, is like, depending on what we do now, that our grandchildren's future will be radically different in so many different ways. And I think, once again, that we're reaching a point where YA can begin to deal with that paradox. There are plenty of YA, wonderful YA fictions about the grandfather paradox, Back to the Future being the Hollywood version thereof, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's not enough yet about this generation's responsibility, just as they're getting to childbearing age, just as they're getting to political empowerment. It's on them, because my generation, and to some extent your generation, has just kind of completely failed them. And so their idea of responsibility in a forward direction, I think, is much more powerful, or it needs to be. But I also think that it is more powerful. And it's interesting. I think there's a number of fictions that are starting to deal with that, your own included.
Yeah. Until in a way, one of the inspirations for writing Cli-fi in the first place was actually a non-fiction book, was Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything, because that came out a few years before what I was writing. And she even says in that book, she says, look, I honestly didn't start like getting into climate change and those politics until she had a young daughter. And then it was like, she's not just thinking about her own future, but like, her daughters and her daughters' children, and so it is one of those things that I think pushes a sort of call to action. And
it's
absolutely.
Interesting that you mentioned Naomi Klein, because again, maybe we had talked about this. I don't think so. So I've met you. You do know that I did a campus abroad in 2014 in London. So we've talked about that with Foothill College. So was there with about 40 California community college students, and experiencing London is one of the great experiences of my life. But 2014 was the year that Naomi Klein's book came out, and I remember buying it. I bought it in my wonderful, incredible local British bookstore in London. There it was, prominently featured. I found it devastating. It changed my life. That my dedication. I had always taught climate change. I'd always taught sustainability. That's what I wrote my dissertation on at Stanford a million years ago. But that's when I decided that there isn't anything else to do, that I've got to teach climate change across the curriculum, and that it has to be climate change all the time. And the moment came, by the way, not only had Naomi's book came out, but I was in the middle of reading Naomi Klein's book, and then the global march happened, right? And so I went out into London, and there were more than 1 million people on the streets in London and in many other major cities across the world. And I stood in a group of 1 million people in the center of London, 1 million, most of whom were far younger than me. So many young people were out. And again, this kind of idea that may we please shift the consciousness. But it was such a slap in the face. And it was also, again, to be at an age now where I'm looking at people much younger than myself, and they're the ones marching, and they're the ones saying, you've got to do something. And Naomi Klein, as you say, who's having a daughter and thinking about these things, says, that everything has to change. So the anthology that you were in was conveniently named Everything Change. And then Naomi Klein's book was This Changes Everything, and that's all based on, of course, a fiction writer's.
I think it was originally a quote from Margaret Atwood. They said, we've got to stop thinking of it as climate change. It's everything change, because it will impact on every aspect of life.